So, the world stage is set with a lot of unfolding dramas that are going to reshape the political landscape. Today we're going to dive into the heart of a conflict where America, in a bold move, launches retaliatory strikes in the Middle East, igniting tensions and setting the stage for a possible wider conflict. Amidst the shadows, Georgia uncovers a clandestine package from Ukraine, revealing the complex web of international intrigue and the lengths nations will go to assert their dominance. Meanwhile, the digital battlefield heats up as China is accused of orchestrating a cyber onslaught against the Philippines, challenging the fragile peace and testing the resolve of nations to stand against aggression. So stay with us as we unpack these stories, providing insights and analysis on what these developments mean and why they matter. Our lead story today comes out of the Middle East, where in the aftermath of a fatal attack on a US outpost in Jordan, American retaliatory strikes have left the region reeling. Amidst promises of more airstrikes to come, a parallel series of strikes against Yemen's Houthi rebels, and at least one subsequent strike against American positions, the last week has seen the United States increasingly drawn into a wider conflict that it had spent months working overtime to avoid. By far the most defining moment of the last several days in the Middle East came on Friday the 2nd of February, when a United States air assault rained bombs down on a series of targets suspected of being used by a range of Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. By about midnight local time, heading into Saturday, February 3rd, a group of American A-10C Thunderbolt II attack planes and F-15E Strike Eagles escorted two B-1B Lancer bombers. Those bomber aircraft were deployed from an airbase in the US state of Texas and refueled in flight so as to ensure that partner nations in the Middle East would not be liable for having allowed US warplanes to attack Arab targets from airbases on their soil. Flying over a stretch of Iraq and Syria, where a wide variety of Iranian-backed militias are known to maintain a presence, the bomber and strike aircraft struck a total of 7 facilities, including 3 in Iraq and 4 in Syria, using a total of 125 precision-guided missiles. At those 7 facilities, a total of 85 individual targets were identified and struck directly, with at least 8 of those targets having been confirmed as completely destroyed or otherwise inoperable. In terms of the individual targets, the strikes hit a range of tactically relevant facilities: command and control centers, intelligence structures, munitions stockpiles, including storage for missiles, rockets and drones, logistical supply depots, and more. Although it's difficult to pinpoint a precise death toll here, at least 45 militants are believed to have been killed between Iraq and Syria, including at least 29 in Syria, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Satellite imagery has confirmed devastation of multiple targeted facilities, and reports from area residents have confirmed widespread destruction, although they also attested that some bands of militants had already left the area by the time the attack came down. Whether any of the individuals killed in the attack were members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and particularly its Quds Force Special Forces element, is yet unclear, but many of the targets struck by the US are believed to have been used jointly by both the Quds Force and the local militias that relied on them as bases. As explained by National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, the American airstrikes were meant to degrade the capability of all adversarial forces in the region, be they Syrian, Iraqi, or Iranian, to be able to launch attacks against American targets. Basically, it's the infrastructure damage that the US was after, not casualties among individuals hailing from specific nations. In addition to the air attacks, US officials have indicated that Washington conducted unspecified cyber operations against Iran on the same day, although information on those operations has been scarce in the following week. Lastly, Washington levied new sanctions against companies believed to be involved with Iran's missile and drone programs. The airstrikes were launched as a retaliatory measure by the United States after a drone attack on an American outpost called Tower 22 killed 3 US soldiers. Although Tower 22 was technically on Jordanian territory, it was located at the fringes of Jordan's outlying border regions, well within range of militants in both Iraq and Syria. The attack that prompted America's retaliation was not the first attempted strike by Syrian or Iraqi militants against US troops in the Middle East, or even the first one to cause American casualties, but it was the first to cause American frontline deaths since the militant group's current campaign began. As America's B-1B Lancers were on their way to the Middle East on Friday the 2nd, Joe Biden himself was attending the transfer of those 3 American soldiers' bodies at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. In the days leading up to the American retaliation, it was unclear who or what the United States would be targeting. The organization that took credit for the lethal strike against Tower 22 was the so-called Islamic Resistance in Iraq. But the Islamic Resistance in Iraq is not a single militia. Instead, it's an umbrella organization that represents a wide range of pro-Iran militant groups in Iraq, many of which also operate in Syria. They're also a pretty new organization, only popping up in 2020, and really became a meaningful entity only after the current wave of Middle Eastern hostilities kicked off in October 2023. Now, that ambiguity meant that on the one hand, the Islamic Resistance resistance in Iraq, taking credit for the attack, didn't actually tell the world about which group launched the drone in question, and on the other hand, it was left unclear whether the decision to attack Tower 22 was made by the Islamic resistance in Iraq's leaders, by the leaders of a single militia, or even by decision makers in Iran. With that ambiguity, led to a range of questions on the US side. Would the current American administration in Washington choose to identify the militia that was responsible, or attack a range of militia targets regardless of their exact affiliation, or even take the fight directly to Iran as the nation empowering these militias in the first place? And now, we have our answer. The full range of individual militant organizations targeted is, as of yet, still unknown, but at least 3 have been identified so far. The Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces sustained a direct attack on their headquarters, killing 16. That organization coordinates a network of roughly 67 smaller militias, comprising well over 200,000 fighters between them, and it's seen as one of Iran's most powerful allies inside Iraq. It also shares unusually close ties with the Iraqi government as compared to other regional militias. The splinter organization Kataib Hezbollah was also targeted. They're a very powerful paramilitary group with explicit aims to effect regime change in Iraq and push American forces out of the country, and they receive extensive support from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. Finally, the primary Afghan militia, Liwa Fatemion, based in Syria, was hit in the strikes as well. Liwa Fatemion receives similar levels of support from the IRGC, and they've become one of the most experienced fighting units left in Syria. In the wake of the strikes, the United States left no illusions about whether it considered its mission accomplished. In the words of US President Joe Biden in the immediate aftermath of the incident, quoting, "Our response began today. It will continue at times and places of our choosing. Let all those who might seek to do us harm know this. If you harm an American, we will respond." Administration officials have since backed up Biden's assertion that additional strikes are coming and that subsequent attacks will more directly target the IRGC as well as Iraqi and Syrian militias. They've also been careful to specify that the strikes were designed to minimize the risk of civilian casualties and that the US targets were chosen based on specific intelligence information showing that the facilities in question had been directly involved on attacks against American personnel. The strikes represented a major and intentional escalation by the United States in what appeared to be a concerted effort to deter future attacks against Americans in the region. The United States has several thousand troops positioned across this section of the Middle East, in Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, and they've been a favorite target not only for strikes by local militias, but condemnation by a range of Iran-backed or allied entities amidst the ongoing Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. By hitting back against such a high number of seemingly valuable targets and possibly conducting more strikes in the weeks to come, the US appears to be sending a relatively straightforward message to its enemies in the region that attacking American bases simply isn't worth the devastation that will follow. Both in the US and around the world, though, the strikes have elicited a mix of reactions. At home, Biden has been criticized by Washington's Republican opposition from various angles. Senator Roger Wicker, a high-ranking Republican legislator on defense matters, said, "Iran and its proxies have tried to kill American soldiers and sink our warships 165 times, while the Biden administration congratulates itself for doing the bare minimum. Instead of giving the Ayatollah the bloody nose he deserves, we continue to give him a slap on the wrist." Others have criticized the latency period between the attack on Tower 22 and America's retaliation as allowing the Iranians in the region to get out in time. Per Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, quote, "The only Iranian we killed in Syria, Iraq, is some dumbass that doesn't know how to get out of the way. We gave them a week's notice." And Speaker of the House Mike Johnson said, "Unfortunately, the administration waited for a week and telegraphed to the world, including to Iran, the nature of our response." Meanwhile, Iraq has taken issue with the strikes on 2 levels. That's that the Iraqi government was not warned in advance of the strikes that took place, and that whether they were warned or not, they regarded the American attacks as a violation of Iraqi sovereignty. Syria slammed the attack in a similar way, while also accusing the US of making it harder for Syria's own military to address the militants on Syrian soil. Across the Middle East, condemnation of the strike has come not just from the sources one might expect, like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also from the much more neutral nation of Oman. Both Russia and China have issued pointed condemnation, echoing each other's assertions that the US strikes are designed to deliberately inflame existing tensions in the Middle East and open up new avenues to violence. In any case, the promised next rounds of American strikes will have a wealth of targets to choose between. In Iraq's Anbar province and Syria's Deir el-Zor governorate, where the February 2nd airstrikes took place, there are a long list of additional facilities believed to be tied to the local militias, and nearby in Syria's largest cities, Damascus and Aleppo, there are a range of facilities known to be controlled and operated by Iran directly. Iraq hosts similar targets, although until this past week, the United States has been considerably more hesitant to conduct strikes in Iraq in hopes of maintaining a more collaborative diplomatic relationship. What the United States chooses to target in those following strikes will be telling, both because of the range of signals Washington can send by prioritizing certain targets over others, and because of the potential to attack IRGC targets directly, either as part of a broader strategic vision or in response to political pressures at home. But despite political outcry at home, the clear evidence on the ground is that the threat of American air power has already led to substantive changes. In the days leading up to the strike, the Kataib Hezbollah organization announced, quote, the suspension of military and security operations against the occupation forces in order to prevent embarrassment to the Iraqi government. We've already mentioned that Kataib Hezbollah was one of the groups targeted in the airstrike, meaning that the group's decision to pause its operations before the airstrike came in was not enough to spare them retaliation. But it still speaks to the deterrent value of the airstrikes and indicates that external groups, most likely including the governments of Iraq or Iran, may have put rather intense pressure on Kataib Hezbollah to raise the white flag. Not every militia group had the same response. The Harakat al-Najaba movement, for example, vowed to continue its attacks. But Iran itself has been adamant that it does not wish to be engaged in a direct conflict with the United States, and the US has reciprocated with statements from both Biden and his top officials stating that America doesn't want a wider war either. According to US sources, the decision to take out facilities used by Iran's Quds Force but not to target the Quds Force's leadership was intended to signal that the US would prefer both sides to draw down hostilities. Unfortunately, even the best intentions to avoid violence in both America and Iran might not be enough. As we've explained on prior episodes of The Situation Room, even organizations that receive weapons, funding, and strategic orders from Iran aren't typically under Iran's complete control, and whether Iran covertly signed off or not, several militias have since chosen to launch their own retaliatory strikes against the US. In the immediate aftermath of the February 2nd strikes, the US outpost in northeastern Syria was targeted by 2 rockets, and 2 days later, an explosive drone was fired at another outpost in the same area. Those strikes didn't lead to any damage or injury, but the next one did. A base in eastern Syria, housing both American troops and their Kurdish allies in the Syrian Democratic Forces, was attacked on the night of Sunday, the 4th of February. In that attack, a drone struck a training ground where members of the Syrian Democratic Forces specialized commando units were training. At least 6 Kurdish fighters were killed and at least 18 more wounded, although no American casualties were reported. The Islamic Resistance in Iraq has taken credit for the attack, although again, they are an umbrella organization with little offensive capability of their own. Basically, their decision to claim responsibility simply indicates that one of their affiliate militias carried out the attack without specifying which group that might have been. The Syrian Democratic Forces had initially accused, quote, Syrian regime-backed mercenaries of the attack, but the SDF and their American allies have since pivoted in response to the Islamic Resistance in Iraq's admission of guilt. And with further strikes from Iranian-backed militias have come further US airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias, including one that took place as this episode was being written. On Wednesday, the 7th of February, the US Department of Defense announced that an American drone had raided a neighborhood in Baghdad, killing a senior commander of the Kataib Hezbollah organization that we've spoken about so much today. That's the same organization that announced it would halt attacks in the days immediately prior to America's first round of airstrikes. The Kataib Hezbollah commander in question was Abu Bakr al-Sadi, who the US claimed was responsible for, quote, directly planning and participating in the attacks against Americans in the Middle East. He was killed, along with 2 other suspected militants, while driving along a main road in Mashtal. US officials have specified that Iraqi leaders were not notified of this attack before it took place. BBC reporters who reached the scene quickly reported a large and quite hostile public response, and reports out of Baghdad have indicated that Iraqi social media posts may have circulated urging mass assaults on the US embassy in the city's diplomatic green zone. At the time of writing, a growing crowd within the green zone has been confronted by riot police, although if we don't present you with an addendum immediately following this sentence, then the protests did resolve peacefully. Already, the strike has drawn comparisons to former President Donald Trump's drone assassination of Quds Force leader Qasem Soleimani, an act that initially appeared to put Iran a step back, but one that regional experts now widely recognize as a precipitating factor in the current violence. Whether the death of al-Sadi will have a similar effect on Kataib Hezbollah will be revealed with time, one way or the other. In other airstrike news from the Middle East, Sunday the 4th wasn't only an important date because of the attack in eastern Syria. On that same day, US forces and their British counterparts launched the latest round of air attacks against the Houthi rebel organization in Yemen. We've covered the Houthis extensively in prior episodes of the Situation Room, but to recap, the Iranian-backed Houthis have been engaged in a months-long series of missile and drone attacks against commercial and military vessels in the Red Sea, effectively blockading one of the world's busiest shipping routes and forcing a large military response from the US and other nations to safeguard their global trade. Those nations have been reticent to put boots on the ground in Yemen for the purposes of a military response, but in recent weeks, they've embarked on a sustained campaign of airstrikes meant to degrade the Houthis' capabilities to launch attacks. The Houthis, for their part, claim to be attacking Red Sea shipping in order to force the nations of the world to pursue a ceasefire in Gaza amidst the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. In the latest round of airstrikes, the US and Britain struck a total of 36 Houthi targets hours after a smaller preliminary strike that destroyed a handful of anti-ship missiles. The much larger second strike was carried out by a combination of US warships launching ship-to-land missiles, US Fa-18 jets flown from the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, and British Typhoon fighter aircraft attacking targets directly. The attacks hit across 13 distinct locations, possibly including locations in close proximity to Yemen's presidential compound. That's according to sources on the ground. A joint statement from Britain and the US indicated that weapon storage facilities, missile launches, air defense systems, and radar systems were among their selected targets. While the United States did not specify whether the airstrikes against the Houthis should be taken as part of their ongoing retaliation for the Tower 22 attack, the scale and variety of this particular attack does mimic the US strikes in Iraq and Syria more closely than they mimic most British-American joint attacks against the Houthis thus far. In a subsequent minor strike, the US eliminated 2 autonomous drone boats loaded with explosives on Monday the 5th, although the target of those drone boats is as yet unknown. In Yemen, Houthi spokesman Mohammed al-Baghati vowed that the Houthis, quote, military operations against Israel will continue until the crimes of genocide in Gaza are stopped and the siege on its residents is lifted, no matter the sacrifices it costs us. He continued, American-British aggression against Yemen will not go unanswered, and we will meet escalation with escalation. True to their word, the Houthis have since launched ballistic missile attacks against 2 ships traveling in and around the Red Sea. On Tuesday the 6th, the Barbados-flagged UK-owned cargo ship Morningtide received minor damage after 3 ballistic missiles encroached on its position. That same day, the Greek-owned Marshall Islands-flagged Star Asia carrier was attacked in an identical fashion by 3 more ballistic missiles, one of those missiles being shot down by the American destroyer USS Laboon, and minor damage, but no injuries, were reported on board. But although the Houthis' latest attacks have largely been thwarted, months of continuous threats to global shipping have forced the world to begin adjusting for the long term. Many companies have been forced to continue diverting their shipping traffic around the Cape of Good Hope, meaning that ships now have to go all the way around the African continent instead of bypassing Africa entirely via the Red Sea. These sorts of things lead to major delays, higher costs for individual ships to travel, and financial losses due to radical adjustments in insurance prices for ships that do choose to traverse the Red Sea. All that might not have been too much of an issue if these attacks went on for the span of a few days or weeks. Now that they've been ongoing for multiple months, it's a different story, and companies that haven't yet felt the pain of those shipping disruptions seem to broadly understand that they are about to. And with that strain, the Houthis hope those countries will begin to push more actively for a Gaza ceasefire so that they can get back to business as usual. One recent red flag comes out of Egypt's Suez Canal, where revenues dropped by nearly 50% in January compared to prior months. Those revenues are collected from ships that traverse the Red Sea. And while the financial losses for Egypt don't cause that much of an issue, they are a flashing red light that a massive proportion of Red Sea shipping traffic is no longer traveling their normal routes. And in a final related update from this corner of the world, new information has also circulated about the attack that set off last week's spike in violence, the attack on Tower 22. Here, 2 revelations take precedent. First, confirmation of the drone used to strike the US base, and second, insight into just how that drone was able to get close enough to the base that it was able to kill American soldiers. The drone itself was an Iranian-made Shahed 136, a 200-kilogram, 3.5-meter long pusher-prop plane that Iran has been spreading around the world in massive numbers. Capable of traveling low to the ground and slow at a speed of around 185 kilometers an hour, that's 150 miles per hour, the drone has been used in Yemen, Ukraine, Syria, and Iraq. Now, the fact that the drone was Iranian-made and found its way into the hands of an Iranian-backed proxy to strike American targets isn't that much of a shock on its own. However, the Tower 22 attack does represent the first time that American personnel have been killed by the Shahed 136, which American and international analysts expect to be a fixture of future hostilities between the US and Iran-affiliated adversaries around the world. More difficult for the US to stomach are revelations about the air defenses present at Tower 22, or more accurately, the lack thereof. According to military sources who've served at Tower 22, the base was not equipped with proper anti-drone defenses. As one Air Force airman told The Intercept anonymously, the air defenses were minimal, if any. We relied heavily on aircraft from MSAB to stop any targets. We had a radar system called the TPS-75 that was broken 80% of the time I was there. That acronym, MSAB, by the way, refers to a nearby Jordanian airbase where US troops are stationed. Said another service member, they have outposts surrounding the base, but that does little to nothing when faced with attacking aircraft. Other soldiers interviewed have suggested that the base does not have the proper alert systems to warn of an attack, and American troops have had to warn each other via phone call or even knocking on each other's doors. Some sources, including the Associated Press, have alluded to basic counter-drone systems at Tower 22, but those reports are not confirmed as of yet. Others indicate that Tower 22 only had electronic jamming technologies meant to disrupt an incoming drone's flight path, but clearly those didn't work if they do exist. Without a functioning radar, an appropriate anti-drone defense system, or any other weapon systems ready to respond to the incoming threat, the Shahed drone was able to evade detection until it was already at the base, by which time it would have been far too late for anybody to respond, if anybody even saw it at all. Reports in the aftermath of the attack had suggested that Tower 22's air defenses may have been lowered to allow a known US drone to pass by, but those reports have since been debunked. Tower 22 was simply not equipped to stop an attack of this type, and it was a matter of good fortune for the United States that vulnerability hadn't been exploited sooner. Of course, the other side of those revelations is an even more somber realization that if these paltry defenses on America's smaller Middle East air bases are known to news organizations, then they'll soon become known to the same militias who've perpetrated attacks over the last few months. Kataib Hezbollah may not have the military power to stand up to the US in an outright war, but they've certainly got an internet connection, and it's only a matter of time before this sort of news makes its way to groups who wish to do the US harm. Now the question is whether these smaller outposts can either streamline their current air defenses or get new equipment on site before Iraqi and Syrian militias can take advantage. And that's a race where the militias have a massive head start even after the first wave of US airstrikes. Make no mistake, the US can address this issue, and according to the Defense Department, new systems are already earmarked to be sent. But whether they arrive in time and can be set up before the next attack, well, that's another question entirely. With a new round of American airstrikes in the rearview mirror, we're left asking a far broader question. Is the US slowly being pulled into a conflict that it has been adamant that it doesn't want to be a part of? And we've got to emphasize here that the decision by Iran's proxy organizations in Iraq and Syria to attack the United States is certainly not an arbitrary one. Nor is the strategic purpose of those attacks simply to act out their anger toward the US. Iran and its proxies want the United States actively engaged in conflict, bogged down across the Middle East, and engaging in the deeply unpopular work of attacking Middle Eastern targets, establishing a larger military presence in Middle Eastern nations, and tying itself to the actions and intentions of nations like Israel, who Iran sees as its primary adversary in the region. And both Iran and its proxies have maintained that their ultimate goal in this ongoing round of violence is to force a ceasefire in Gaza, offering both an off-ramp for the United States to effect an end to hostilities if it wishes, and a clear indicator that if a Gaza ceasefire remains elusive, these militias will continue to engage violently, even at cost to themselves and their personnel. Whether a ceasefire in Gaza is anywhere near achievable, well, that's a story for another episode. Iran does not want to go to war with the United States directly, far from it. But much like Hamas has continued to draw Israel into Gaza despite massive personnel losses, Iran doesn't particularly care how many of its supporters on the ground in Iraq and Syria will be killed by the United States. As Israel is now drawing horrified condemnation from much of the world for its conduct in Gaza, so too does Iran seek to lure the United States into a position in which they are perceived as a destructive force amidst broader Middle Eastern carnage. Whether America's most recent airstrikes deter Iran from that objective or play directly into Iran's hands, well, only history can tell us. And that history's not been written yet. Now, moving on from the Middle East, we travel to the small nation of Georgia, tucked between Russia and Turkey on the coast of the Black Sea. On Monday, the 5th of February, Georgia's primary domestic security organization, the State Security Services, or SSSG, revealed that it had seized a clandestine shipment of explosives taking a long route from the Ukrainian port city of Odessa and the southwestern Russian city of Voronezh. This is not the sort of shipment that would normally need to come through Georgia if it was an innocuous piece of cargo. You can drive from the city of Voronezh to the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv in just 5 hours or so, and direct to Odessa over the course of about 15 hours. Or you could if Ukraine and Russia were, of course, very much at war. Instead, this particular package is believed to have come via a much longer land route out of Ukraine through the NATO member nations of Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, and up through Georgia with an additional 18 hours of road travel ahead of it before it finally reached Voronezh. The explosives were found in a Ukrainian-owned minivan hidden in cargo designed to look like car batteries. Said the SSSG, quote, "It has been determined that the explosive devices contain military-grade C4 plastic explosives, which can be activated with an electronic detonator and a special timer. The total weight of the explosives is 14 kilograms, 31 pounds. The SSSG stated that a total of 6 explosive devices were identified and that 3 of them were left in the Georgian capital city of Tbilisi, while 3 others were taken on an attempt to cross the border in an operation involving 7 Georgians, 3 Ukrainians, and 2 Armenians. Any stated purpose that the people transporting the shipment might have provided to the Georgian SSSG has not yet been publicized, but international observers in the know have had few illusions about just what this was. According to accusations by Russia's government in Moscow, a similar overland route was Ukraine's weapon of choice when delivering a truck bomb that exploded on the Kerch Strait Bridge in October 2022. Traveling basically the circumference of the Black Sea, that truck bomb had allegedly driven out onto the bridge, which Russia inaugurated in 2018 to provide an overland route between Russia and the annexed Ukrainian isthmus of Crimea before exploding and causing a fire and a large-scale collapse of a section of the bridge. The bridge has been targeted in multiple subsequent attacks, although not quite with the effectiveness of that first blast. Ukraine has been mum on the issue of the explosives-packed minivan in Georgia, and there are no direct indicators that it would have been headed for the Kerch Strait Bridge. Ukraine has attacked a wide range of targets in Russia in recent months, including via the use of explosives, as it attempts to broaden its counter-offensive and bring the cost of Russia's ongoing invasion home to some of its citizens. Ukraine's only substantive statement on the incident thus far came by way of its embassy in Georgia, which said it was looking into the allegations Georgia had made and asked the current Georgian administration not to politicize the issue. But regardless of the minivan's intended target, its purpose is clear, caught at the final leg of a multinational expedition to try and infiltrate Russia. The incident comes at a difficult time for the nation of Georgia, as former Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili has just stepped down and appointed a successor, Prime Minister-designate one Iralki Kobakhidzhi. Both men are members of the Georgian Dream Party, which has been hesitant to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and which many Georgians see as an extension of Russia's will in their own country. In 2022, several members of the Georgian Dream Party split off into a new faction, People's Power, to accuse the European Union and the US of trying to turn Georgia into a second battlefront against Russia. Why that's important now is because it's a sentiment that is echoed directly by the Prime Minister-designate as he responded to the intercepted explosives van in his first week in office, saying, "This once again confirms what, in principle, the high-ranking officials of the Ukrainian government openly said they wanted and probably still want. A second front in our country." The quote ends. Georgia has already fought one war against modern-day Russia directly, and that war ended quickly in a lightning offensive for which Georgia was placed decisively on the losing side. That sort of national memory makes it all too easy for Georgia's politicians and its people to fear any sign sent to Russia that might tie them in with Ukraine's resistance, perhaps prompting the strength of the condemnations that we've seen thus far. If, indeed, the minivan in question was destined to arrive in Voronezh, there are a few meaningful targets where it may have been destined to arrive. The airbase Voronezh-Malchovo is located just outside of the city, and it's believed to be the home of 2 squadrons worth of Sukhoi Su-34 fighter aircraft. The airbase Batanovka is located about 2.5 hours outside of Voronezh proper, but it's still well within the Voronezh Oblast, or region, and it too is believed to have several fighter aircraft stationed there. If Ukraine were especially bold, it could have targeted the Voronezh 45 nuclear base, itself a 3-hour drive from the city proper. It also hosts a major aircraft production plant, a company that builds and develops electronic warfare equipment, and a mechanical plant that produces missile parts and aircraft engines, as well as more basic targets like oil depots or chemical production facilities. Ukraine is known to have targeted Voronezh in the past in drone and explosive attacks. While the interception of a lone minivan in Tbilisi may not be enough to change the geopolitical balance of Eastern Europe, it nonetheless speaks to underlying realities in the region. First, Ukraine is still hard at work trying to orchestrate and carry out retaliatory attacks in Russia, despite the hard realities of their flagging military support around the world and their hardening stalemate across a front line hundreds of miles long. Second, despite its shared history of weathering direct invasion by Russia, the nation of Georgia, or at least its leadership, is taking pains not to appear complicit in any way with the movement of munitions that could be used against Russia in its war efforts. And for our final story today, we turn to the Philippines, where the archipelago nation has weathered a large-scale cyber attack attributed to hackers operating out of China. This, as China has been engaged in a long campaign of harassment against the Philippines at sea, using their own Coast Guard vessels and a fleet of purported fishing boats that are widely understood to belong to China's maritime militia. The recent cyber attack is just one in a long series that the Philippines believes can be attributed to online forces within China, but they come at a tense moment in which China and the Philippines have recently agreed to draw down their tensions, and each have been waiting to see whether the opposing side would keep their word. The cyber attack hit Manila during the month of January, but they were reported on the 5th of February. They came by way of a wide-ranging attack that attempted to smash through various Philippine websites and email systems. Among the items on the hit list were the personal website of Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, the website for the Philippine Coast Guard, and the inboxes for Philippines Department of Information and Communications Technology, DICT. The hackers used Chinese state-owned software to carry out the attack and were able to break through a first layer of defense that the Philippines had been working hard to set up around its digital infrastructure. Luckily for the Philippines, the attacks were ultimately unsuccessful. Now, we don't bring you this story just to tell you about a failed hack. There are plenty of those stories to tell all around the world, but we typically don't bring them to you here, nor do we mean to imply that China has actively broken its word to draw down tensions with the Philippines. These attacks have just been announced, but they took place in January, when the two countries were still hammering out an agreement to address their differences. Instead, we bring it to you to illustrate the force with which China has expressed their opposition to hacking operations taking place in China, even despite the nation's long history of both perpetrating large-scale cyber espionage against other countries and declining to intervene in the acts of private hackers on Chinese soil or using Chinese infrastructure. As opposed to the outrage or the thinly veiled malice that's sometimes evident in China's response to similar accusations, China has avoided the impulse to deny that the attacks were related to China. Said the Chinese embassy in Manila, the Chinese government all along firmly opposes and cracks down on all forms of cyber attack in accordance with the law, allows no country or individual to engage in cyber attack and other illegal activities on Chinese soil or using Chinese infrastructure. Plenty of details there to take issue with, but nonetheless, it was a full-throated condemnation when, in recent months where the Philippines was concerned, an annoyed denial and a wink to the camera would have done just fine. This hesitation goes two ways as well. According to a Filipino government spokesman named Renato Paracio, quote, "We are not attributing this to any state, but using the internet protocol addresses, we pinpointed it to China. We are appealing to the Chinese government to help us prevent further attacks." It's not a condemnation. It leaves room for positive cooperation. It's a different statement to the Philippines' usual response where potential Chinese antagonism is concerned. It's rare on this particular channel that we get to bring our audience good news on any level. But over a period of several highly contentious months between China and the Philippines, we're able to draw attention to at least one conflict where both sides outwardly appear interested in drawing tensions down instead of spiraling them upward. This is one minor incident, and we certainly don't intend to make it any more than that. But when nations with a relationship like these two decide to shake hands and let even one minor slight be forgiven, it's a good indicator that somehow, somewhere, a conflict is headed in the right direction. With any luck, we won't need to bring you much more about news on China and the Philippines in the coming months. But as for the conflict in the Middle East, Ukraine's ongoing war with Russia, and the great big spiraling mess that is modern geopolitics, well, we'll be here to cover it. For now, signing off. Thanks for being here.